essentially what I'm going to talk to you guys about today are just some perspectives from across the pond in the States. So I just wanted to really start big picture here with just a really simple conceptual diagram to point out that the markets that I'm going to talk about today are compliance markets. So in these types of regulatory driven markets, generally the government is both creating the regulatory requirements that are going to drive demand in the market, as well as creating the codes and standards that oversee the generation of the ecosystem credits that are then sold by private entities or private sellers. Obviously, this diagram gets much more complicated when you're talking about non-compliance markets, where your demand is not driven solely by offset requirements, and where you might have multiple voluntary credit schemes developed by multiple entities under competing codes. We're not going to get into any of that today. We're kind of keeping within the simpler construct of these, regulatory market systems. So I just wanted to provide a broad overview of 3 of the regulatory ecosystem markets that currently exist in the States. One is conservation and species markets. So these are focused on the species and habitats that support the species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so these markets are administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries. The second one that we kind of have are the stream and wetland markets. And these are administered by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And these provide compensatory mitigation for impacts to wetlands and streams that are happening as part of the Clean Water Act Section 404 permitting program, which deals with dredge and fill impacts to waters of the U.S. And then the third piece is water quality trading. This is administered by various states, so often state by state via rules, regulations, policy, or guidance. And essentially under water quality trading, it's not necessarily an offset market the way that the species markets and stream and wetland markets are, but essentially in water quality trading, you're looking at where a point source pollution discharge can meet their Clean Water Act regulatory obligations by looking at pollution reductions elsewhere in the watershed. And so that's really kind of the concept of water quality trading that is happening under the markets. So the next thing that I just wanted to highlight here is that there is a tracking system that exists in the States that's built to accommodate all 3 of these types of credits. So this is kind of the general repository for credit ledgers. You can find credits available for sale here, and it serves just generally as a repository for information on specific mitigation banks, water quality trading sites. Project-specific documentation includes things like the instrument itself, any types of financial assurances, the credit availability, monitoring reports can be posted here, and those types of things. And then the site also includes some really good programmatic information on the different tools and assessment approaches that are available in different parts of the U.S. for different service areas and different markets. So that's just like a really, really broad overview of the 3 markets. And we have quite a small group today, so I'll just pause at this point in time and see if there's any thoughts or questions or anything anyone wants to jump in with at this point. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, great. That's really interesting, Julia. So you say project developers can then upload the unit or credit as they kind of issue it onto this platform?
Yeah.
Almost like it's a marketplace as well.
Yeah, kind of. It is a marketplace, so they can look at what credits, so they can type in their kind of the location of their impact, right? Their impact project, and then they can find, are there third parties that are selling credits within that area, and are they available at that location? And then they know kind of what their options would be available looking at third party compensation.
And there's no secondary market?
No.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just a quick question. Thanks, Julia. I take it then, given that it's sort of hosted by the government, various state governments, etc., that all the credits and the information here is, if you like, endorsed by the government. So it's got that backing, given that they're sort of administering the website. Yeah.
Yep. So these are all the credits here are approved for sale. So I'll get into the different instruments in a minute under the stream and wetland markets, but essentially mitigation banks are developed using a mitigation bank instrument, which is essentially a contract between the credit developer and the regulatory agency.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So now we're going to dive into water markets. Pun is definitely intended there. So first, I just wanted to provide kind of just this overview of the Clean Water Act. So the Clean Water Act is really kind of the regulatory mechanism that drives both water quality trading and the stream and wetland markets in the states. And so the Clean Water Act is a federal law that essentially the goal of which is to maintain the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of waters of the U.S. And it does this in multiple ways. And essentially, two elements of under the Clean Water Act are point source pollution permitting. And so this is where you have what I've mentioned before, Section 404, which is the dredge and fill of waters of the U.S. And that's what drives the stream and wetland program. And then you have the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. And these are kind of your point source pollution discharges as you kind of typically think of pollution going into waters. And then there's also a series of non-point source pollution programs as well to deal with agricultural runoff, other diffuse sources of water quality impairment. And a lot of times the non-point source pollution programs are funding driven. So EPA funds a lot of watershed planning to address non-point source pollution. And so, like I said, here's kind of where the water markets fit in. So the water markets are tied into kind of the permitting requirements under the Clean Water Act. And then water quality trading kind of looks at kind of other available ways to reduce pollutants going into a watershed. And so, there's water quality trading that's been developed for things like temperature, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, total suspended solids, and things like that. So I am not, and this is not my area of expertise, so I'm just going to provide kind of like a really 40,000 foot view of kind of how water quality trading works. So essentially, most water quality programs, including standards development and permitting, are delegated to the states. So the states will set water quality standards, and this is then what informs the limits for issuing point source discharge permits. And then essentially, once they have set the water quality standards, they'll identify impairments in the watershed. So these are, and then the waters will be listed for certain types of impairments. Then what will happen oftentimes is the development of total maximum daily loads, or what we like to call TMDLs. And these are essentially used to determine the pollution reduction targets and allocate load reductions. So a total maximum daily load is essentially the maximum amount of a pollutant that's allowed to enter a water body so that the water body will still meet and continue to meet water quality standards. And so that's basically kind of, you can think of that as like, the cap essentially. And then what happens is, you can look at implementing water quality trading or other pollution reduction strategies, which ultimately then reduce the pollution loads and allow the water to attain water quality standards. So essentially, the TMDL is really what kind of drives and sets the expectations for water quality trading and water quality trading programs in the various states. And at this point in time, I think there's about 12 states that have some sort of water quality trading. Perhaps one of the biggest programs is the Chesapeake Bay total maximum daily load, which I think involves multiple states like Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia. And so that's quite an well-established program. But then there's also other water quality trading programs that have been around for a long time. North Carolina, Oregon, there's programs in Connecticut, Ohio, Florida, Louisiana, Missouri, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Colorado, and Montana. So there's quite a range of states that are implementing various kind of levels of water quality trading in the states. And so again, just kind of going back to show you what's on rivets. If you look here, so they've actually expanded rivets recently to also incorporate water quality trading. You can see on here, there's a toggle here. You can track mitigation, water quality trading, both. And then this is just looking at the water quality trading assessment tools that they have available on there. At this point in time, Virginia is the only state that has put their water quality trading into rivets for their tracking. It's not really available in other states. But this is essentially what it looks like if you go to the map view. You can see this is Virginia. And then these are all the different projects that are offering water quality trades. And if you click on any of those little droplets, what comes up is a link to the specific project and the specific project documentation. And in this case, it shows you the different types of water quality credits that they are trading. And it shows you how many credits are available, how many have been sold, and whatnot. So it provides information on the credit ledger. So that is about the all I'm going to cover on water quality trading, but I will stop here and just instead of you guys asking, well, you can ask me questions, which I may or may not be able to answer, but I thought also it would be a good opportunity to just ask folks here what aspects of water quality trading programs in the States do you think are most useful to learn from for developing water markets in the UK? So what would you want to learn more about with regard to water quality trading in the States? You can raise your hand, you can throw something in the chat, you can put something on the Miro board, and we'll just take a minute and pause here and just get anyone's thoughts or ideas. All right. Yeah, Rosie.
Hi, Julia. Thanks. I mean, I guess not surprising from me, but things I'm really keen to learn more about is partly on the metric side. I think also just how things really work in practice in terms of timings of the credits. You know, as a company, you're having to offset this impact, I guess on like an annual basis. But if you're like investing in a project, like how many years it sort of represents, and you know how that's kind of calculated as like a moving baseline or just compared to like a particular year, and how that's sort of dealt with. I guess and just generally the kind of key issues that we have to deal with, thinking about setting up codes, obviously from my perspective, the woodland water code, but also the woodland carbon code in terms of issues around permanence, also leakage, how that's sort of dealt with, and any kind of interventions they're doing. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's useful. Thanks, Rosie. Anyone else have anything before we move on?
Yeah, can I jump in? Sorry, I can't even find my raise hand function. I don't know what I'm doing. Anyway, Julie, it'd be really good to hear more about, you know, the sort of metrics behind it, how they're set, similar to what Rosie was getting at. And what was I going to say? Get somebody else. It will come back to me. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted today.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, Julia. Shall I read them out for you, or are you? How would you like to do this?
Yeah. So Matt has a question about how do the projects tend to get financed, and that's a good question. As far as water quality trading specifically, I don't necessarily know the answer to that. I do know that for kind of the compensatory mitigation projects, which we're going to talk about next, they are all kind of privately funded. So there's private funding and investment that gets put forward there. It can't be grant funded. So can't use public funding to generate required offsets. Yeah. And then Andy just had a comment, non-point source pollution aspects would be most useful. So yeah, that again kind of gets at what Rosie was talking about as far as how it all works out in practice and what the different kind of activities are occurring that are reducing those pollution loads and how that's measured. So yeah, I think diving in more to the water quality trading programs, I think there's a pretty good wealth of information in the states. And it would just be a matter of figuring out how we would want to kind of target that to get the right information out of it and what that might look like. So something for the, yeah, Louise, go ahead.
Julie, yeah, my question's come back to me now. It was about monitoring and how the sort of credits and the water quality trading supports the monitoring and to sort of verify the credits and how that's funded. So specifically for sort of the diffuse pollution, how is that tackled? Good to hear more about that. Thank you.
Excellent. Cool. Thanks. And anyone else? All right. We shall keep on keeping on then. So next I wanted to switch gears and just talk about now moving into kind of the stream and wetland markets. And this is really kind of where my background is as far as, you know, my experience back working in the States and everything like that. So first off, before we kind of dive into mitigation banking, I wanted to kind of put it into the context of how stream and wetland mitigation banking fits into the permitting process. And so, you know, essentially when someone comes in to apply for a permit to impact waters of the US, so this could be, you know, a roadway or a bridge project. This could be, you know, a large box store wanting to develop a new site and there's wetlands on the site, or there's a stream running through the middle of the site and they want to relocate it. Those types of impacts are essentially going to trigger the Clean Water Act 404 permit. So when they come in to apply for the permit, essentially the agencies determine compliance with the implementing regulations, the environmental regulations, and part of that is applying the mitigation hierarchy. So essentially, as part of the permit application, they have to look at what alternatives are available to those, you know, that would maybe reduce or avoid impacts to waters of the US. And so they can only permit the least environmentally damaging practical alternatives. So they have to do that alternatives analysis as part of their avoidance. And then they look at, you know, additional design tweaks or risk reduction strategies that might further minimize impacts to aquatic resources. And then what you end up with after that is unavoidable impacts as part of the project. And those require mitigation. And this is where essentially the stream and wetland markets come into play. There are 3 different mechanisms to offset impacts under the permit. So one is the mitigation bank credits. The second, and so mitigation banks are sites essentially that generate credits for restoration, establishment, enhancement, or preservation of aquatic resources. And so they can then sell credits to projects looking to offset their impacts. There's in lieu fee programs, which are essentially where fees are paid to a governmental or nonprofit natural resource management entity to satisfy mitigation requirements. So then the ILF programs or in lieu fee programs take these funds and use them to strategically restore, establish, enhance, or preserve aquatic resources within the watershed or the service area. Both banks and in lieu fee programs sell compensatory mitigation credits to permittees, and then that essentially transfers the permittee's offset obligation to the bank or the in lieu fee program sponsor. Then there's a third mechanism which doesn't really involve this type of banking at all, and that's called permittee responsible mitigation. And that's essentially where the project developer or the person coming in for the permit essentially offsets those impacts themselves. And so then they're kind of maintaining that responsibility for all of the expectations around creating the compensatory mitigation that otherwise the bank or the in lieu fee program would be responsible for. So that's really kind of the nature of how the market fits into the permitting program and the context of it. And so just kind of a little bit of a historical perspective on the stream and wetland mitigation markets in the States. So they've been around for a really long time. they go back to really, I think 1983, the Fish and Wildlife Service put out interim guidance on mitigation banking. And, you know, in the 80s, you saw mostly publicly sponsored single-use banks. So things like the State Department of Transportation would develop a large mitigation project that then, as they kind of had piecemeal impacts through different permits here and there, they would then use that one large site to kind of consolidate all of their offsets or impacts. Entrepreneurial banking, really where, you know, the banks were available and selling credits to anyone, really started to emerge in the early 90s. In 1995, the federal agencies, a collection of federal agencies, released federal guidance on the establishment, use, and operation of mitigation banks. And this really created more structure and certainty for investing in mitigation banking and for people to start developing credits. And so kind of as the business of banking grew in the 90s, you know, so did the wealth of knowledge on how successful mitigation banking actually was in practice. And there came with that a lot of critiques on, you know, the ability of the mitigation marketplace essentially to effectively offset impacts under the permitting program. So, you know, there's these big goals of no net loss within the program. And, you know, are mitigation banks actually successfully and equivalently offsetting the impacts that are occurring, or are we actually losing more than what we're gaining, right? So are we coming in at an, you know, evens, or are we losing? And so perhaps one of the most influential of these reviews happened in 2001, and that was the National Research Council conducted a comprehensive assessment of wetland mitigation projects. And they came out with a set of key recommendations around how the mitigation program, essentially how they could improve planning, implementation, and management of mitigation projects. You know, and these recommendations included things like being a little bit more watershed driven and looking at watershed needs in figuring out where to select the location for compensatory mitigation sites, looking at measurable and enforceable ecological performance standards, consistent project elements so that, you know, all projects are providing the same administrative performance and documentation, requirements for regular monitoring, and the use of science-based assessment procedures are just kind of a collection of these. And so I think, you know, when we look at kind of the early feedback that's coming out of some of the pilots of BMG, you know, we see some of the same questions around you know, the ability of offsets to really adequately compensate for the impacts, you know, and a lot of questions around, you know, consistent enforcement and mitigation and these types of things. And so these are kind of some of the same issues around implementation and management of mitigation sites that we saw happening back at the turn of the millennia, I guess, so back around 2001. And so this led to a new rule in 2008 that really kind of established equivalent and effective standards for all forms of mitigation projects under the Clean Water Act. And the new standards really encouraged the expansion, I think, of mitigation banking and the development of in-lieu fee programs because it created a clear preference for third-party mitigation. So basically, in the regulations, there is a preference for mitigation banking over in-lieu fee programs, over permitting responsible mitigation. So essentially, you know, permittees or the people coming in for permit applications are strongly encouraged by the regulations to seek out credits as opposed to doing the offsets themselves. And so just a couple other pieces to highlight here that I think are maybe key differences in kind of what's coming out in the UK versus in the States. And one is the currency. So when we look at credits, the water markets in the States really focus on improvements to ecosystem function. So credit is actually defined as representing the accrual or attainment of aquatic functions at a mitigation site. So whereas I think in the UK, there's a lot of emphasis on ecosystem services, and the markets in the States really focus more on the ecosystem functions themselves and whether sites are creating and maintaining those functions. And then the only other thing that I'll point out, you know, there's a lot of conversations going on in the UK about bundling and stacking. And you do see joint banks. So you see banks where credits are developed for streams, wetlands, species credits, and for water quality trading. And I think that there's a very clear line that's been drawn in the states that allows for stacking. So you can generate credits for within multiple markets within the same kind of co-located project, but you can't unbundle them and sell them to separate entities. So essentially you can receive a payment for one credit type, and then the other credit types in the stack are essentially retired. They can't be sold separately. So you can stack the credits and have multiple credits available for sale, but you can't unbundle them. So only one type of credit can ultimately be sold. And that would be either a species or a wetland or a stream or a water quality credit from that one location. So this is just going back to rivets. Again, this is just an example of the current pending and closed mitigation banks and in lieu fees across the states, just to get a sense of kind of how the market has been developed and where the different projects are. So in this case, circles are banks, diamonds are in lieu fee projects, green ones are active banks, yellow are pending, and the red ones represent banks that have already sold all their credits or are otherwise closed. So within the US, each bank or in lieu fee program will have a specifically defined service area in which they can sell credits. And so these are typically based on kind of watershed units or watershed boundaries. Rivets likes to approximate them using rectangles. So not entirely accurate here as far as their geographical spread, but I think it provides a really good indication of where you have, you know, quite busy and saturated markets and quite a bit of demand, and then other areas where market for you know, stream, wetland, and species credits is less developed in the states. And I think this range, there's a couple different elements, right, that drive the demand for credits, right? So one is the actual demand, right? So do you see sufficient demand for offsets that it supports a market? But then also the other challenge is that if there aren't clear, consistent expectations for crediting and clear outlines for how impact should be assessed, then that can kind of create a governance vacuum where maybe you know, your mitigation bank providers are not willing to go in and establish a bank in a place where the expectations are uncertain. And so that just kind of highlights what I'm going to talk about next, which is that so you have kind of the 2008 mitigation rule, which provides this consistent set of standards for mitigation at a national level. But then within the states, the Corps of Engineers has 8 different divisions and 41 different core districts, and that operate across the 50 states. Each of these oftentimes works independently to develop crediting and debiting procedures and stream and wetland assessment approaches. So oftentimes, you know, you'll have a division or a district that will set their own expectations for how credits are calculated. They'll have their own approved assessment methods. And so across the US, there's a wide range of protocols for calculating credits and assessing streams, even though they kind of all sit underneath the mitigation rule. There's quite a lot of variability there. And there's also differences in kind of where those codes and standards, if you will, have been developed and where they haven't. So this is just, this is an incredibly outdated map. So it's from 2016, which is, if my math is correct, 8 years old. So there's a lot that's changed here, but even though it's outdated, I think I put it up here because I think it illustrates this concept that the codes and standards can be quite varied throughout the United States. So here you can see examples where there's guidance on, you know, how to calculate credits that are coming at a division level. Sometimes they're at that district level, and you can see the district boundaries. And then in the yellow, that's where you have, you know, state-specific standard operating procedures and guidance, and state-specific ways of actually how you're going to assess a stream or wetland and then how are you going to use that assessment to calculate credits. So it is quite variable. So just to kind of like bring that all together, you know, from a governance standpoint, you know, when we talk a lot about codes and standards here, and that's not really the terminology that you use kind of in the States, but essentially, you know, when you're looking at what are the codes and standards, you have kind of that 2008 rule that looks at kind of like setting equivalent effective standards for all forms of mitigation under the Clean Water Rule. And that outlines like 12 different elements that every mitigation project must address. Things like setting objectives, collecting baseline information, determining your credit release schedules, how much credits are available, you know, what performance standards have to be met for them to be released, monitoring plans, long-term management plans, adaptive management, financial assurances. All of these different pieces are required for every single mitigation project, whether it's a bank, in lieu fee program, or the project developer or the permittee is doing it themselves in a permittee responsible project. And then, as I mentioned in the last slide, the second bullet here, core districts can operate independently in how they calculate credits. So you have standard operating procedures and mitigation procedures that are maybe implemented at the division level, the district level, or they might even be state specific. And also you'll have approved assessment approaches for determining stream and wetland function or condition. And those are also often approved by specific core districts or approved for use in specific states. So then, in addition to that, you kind of have a whole rake of other technical guidance documents that may be developed at the national, division, district, and state level. And so these are technical guidance documents on, you know, program effectiveness monitoring, how to develop assessment approaches, you know, templates for developing contracts or financial assurances, other resources that kind of are developed as the program's been implemented to support consistent implementation of mitigation banking and in lieu fee program development. So that's kind of your big broad overview. And you know, next I wanted to dive into kind of an example of a stream assessment and crediting approach that we've worked to develop in several states. But I just want to pause here again for questions and thoughts, you know, and also feedback on kind of what do you guys think is the most useful from this when we think about developing water markets in the UK? Yeah, Louise, go ahead.
Hi, Julia. It'd be really interesting to understand who you touched on it a bit, the project developers are, and whether they're, I mean, I'm guessing because it's a sort of compliance market driven, it predominantly would be like transport agencies, the state itself, planners, etc. And how that might relate to where I feel the sort of movement's going in Scotland, looking at more sort of third-party project developers for, you know, net positive, if you like, and that's more often a consortium of landowners, or it could be a charity, fisheries trust, wildlife trust, etc. And in sort of the difference between who the project developer is and you know, how the sort of the credits are used and managed, and you know, how the guidance is used as well.
Yeah, so project developers, we would call them in the States mitigation bank sponsors. So they're and so sometimes you'll still see, you know, state agencies like the DOTs tend to be developing their own kind of single-use banks still, just because I think it's strategic for them to do that in their planning for their transportation projects. But a lot of your mitigation bank sponsors are kind of private companies and private entities that are, you know, kind of, they have their own form of investment that comes in, and then they're, you know, developing these things privately, and that's essentially their business, right? So they're approaching and working with willing landowners to develop the mitigation bank on the property, and then in lieu fee programs are all kind of government or kind of NGO led. So you know, you'll see entities like the Nature Conservancy, for example, developing inland fee programs. But there's kind of more restrictions on who can develop an inland fee program. So it can't be kind of, private entities, like in the case of mitigation bank sponsors. It's much more kind of focused on just that governmental or quasi-governmental or NGO group of organizations that can develop those.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any thoughts or questions?
Again, there's a few in the chat.
All right.
Okay, let's go with Rosie, and then maybe you could come to the chat ones later if there's time, or after.
Yeah, Rosie, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I guess maybe more of just a kind of big picture question just around, in the UK, I feel like a lot of the codes and standards, there's kind of a national target that they're driving towards, whether it's like, hectares of woodland creation or reversing nature decline. And it sounds like in the US it's all kind of a bit piecemeal. I'm wondering if there's kind of an overall objective of the water markets, and I guess related question of just as any particular successes that you're aware of.
Yeah, so I think one of the big pieces of the mitigation rule, and part of kind of the focus on these on the national standards is this idea of site selection and strategic selection of mitigation sites. And so one of the requirements for developing mitigation banks or inland fee programs is kind of the strategic site selection. And so there's a lot in the regulations that talks about the watershed approach. And so how to kind of prioritize where these mitigation sites are happening, along with, watershed plans and other documentation that would prioritize where the watershed would best be served by the development of these types of, restoration, enhancement, or preservation projects. So I think that's a big piece. That kind of is where that strategic element fits in. And then, as far as examples, yeah, I think putting together a set of examples would probably be pretty useful as well. So we'll make note of that. Jacob, you've popped on? Nope. So let's see. Matt had a question about monitoring the mitigation hierarchy. The point at which it is deemed adequate measures of avoidance have taken place. So there's kind of this test that's called so they basically have to identify the least environmentally damaging practical alternative. And there's a lot of guidance within the program about the level of information kind of being commensurate with the scale of the project. And sometimes the alternatives analysis can be quite expansive in looking for whether there are other alternatives that have less impact. And, sometimes it's just looking at, ways of, can you reposition the footprint of a house in order to not fill a wetland, right? So, it really varies project to project, but that is a specific permit requirement that's outlined in the regulations. And I can provide you with more information on that if you're interested. Let's see, for permitting responsible mitigation, who does the verification? So for all of them, it's essentially the mitigation becomes an enforceable condition within the permit. So all of the monitoring that's required, all the verification that's required, all sits in the enforcement of permit conditions for permit to be responsible. Romini?
Hi, Julia. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, could a mitigation sponsor, I think you called it, could they fund a project, say if they were in North Carolina, could they fund a project in a different state in Florida? Because you mentioned that there were sort of different assessments between different states. I wonder if you'd get a sort of concentration of funding in areas where you generate them, maybe in states where you generate more credits than others, for example, for the same mitigation measures?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I think, a mitigation sponsor can develop a project anywhere. They just have to make sure that they're working within the right expectations and the right codes and standards, essentially, for how they're calculating credits, the assessment approaches that they're using. So, a lot of times you'll see mitigation developers focused in one market area, because then, they're applying the consistent approach in all of their projects. But you do tend to see, there are mitigation providers that do develop projects in different markets across the states. And there are probably variations in how much credit they're getting from a project. So there's still quite a bit of variability in crediting procedures. So some credit procedures are kind of activity-based. If you do X, Y, and Z, then you get this many credits, right? And some have kind of a multiplier that is informed by a condition or a functional assessment method, right? So you may have this number of credits and you multiply it by this based on what the condition is at the site. And then, I think where some of the approaches are moving now is more of a purely kind of function-based credit, potentially with other ratios for administrative factors on top of it. So you really do see quite a bit of variability, and you still have, some credit procedures that are in place from pre 2008. So they don't necessarily incorporate condition assessments and functional assessments as you see in the credit procedures that have been developed since 2008. So there's quite a bit of variability in how credits are calculated from one, core district, or even from state to state.
That's great. Thank you.
Let's see. So how frequently are rules, standards reviews to reflect climate change and associated increased risk? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think that they really are. So, I mean, I think that there's in the instruments, there's certainly considerations when the instruments are developed for, force majeure and other types of considerations as far as, will the site meet its performance standards and whatnot, but those are kind of site-specific considerations, not necessarily at a programmatic level. Okay, next question is from Tanya. What evidence is there of improvements to functional ecology from projects from credit trading? So there's some evidence. So I think that the program is constantly evolving at being able to ask the right questions, right? And so there's a lot of emphasis on, ensuring that the goals of the project and the outcomes that are set are, function-based goals and objectives that have specific monitoring elements that are tied to it. So, I think there's been challenges in the program where, someone's saying, well, our goal is to improve this fish population. But then if there's no performance standards that actually measure fish, then you can't say that you've met that function or you've met that goal, right? And so, I mean, I think that it's a constant evolution, I think, just generally in the field of stream ecology, in setting clear function-based goals and objectives, and then identifying the right indicators to measure in order to answer that question of do we see these improvements and these outcomes actually occurring. So there was a good assessment that was done back in 2016. That was where that map came from, that looked at it was Environmental Law Institute put together kind of a review of like how successful are we. And then there's also a new document that came out in 2022 that looks at ways to evaluate program effectiveness. So are we actually seeing the types of results? And so, I mean, a lot of this is the challenge that there is in every market and in every instance, which is that, to fund this kind of monitoring and to ask these types of questions is always a challenge, right? So, I mean, I think, there is continuously research coming out to say, these types of activities or these types of conservation actions have these results and these effects. Whether it works at a programmatic level, I think is something that, still probably needs to be answered, but I'd like to think that we're on the right track. let's see. Matt, you have more questions about the mitigation hierarchy, but I'm maybe going to table that now. So I'm going to stop with questions there because we have about 10 minutes left. Andy, I'll take yours. Sorry, I just saw your hand was raised.
Oh, thanks, Julia. Sorry, I better put my camera on. Yeah, no. So there's a huge amount of information being provided today, and I'm very grateful for it. And I may have missed an obvious point here, but looking at the non-point source pollution programs, are they entirely funded then, but as a kind of offset to the point source?
No. No. So I mean, the reason why I highlighted them is that they're, it's the non-point source elements that are often used to kind of offset some of the point sources when it comes to looking at like your total maximum daily load, right? It becomes part of the equation that perhaps it's more cost effective to play with. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So what else funds those programs? Because I'm kind of thinking that's probably the most significant. Scotland and UK wide would be the diffuse pollution is probably the most significant in terms of water measures and impacts. And I would imagine the point source bit is probably more tightly controlled with the permitting for cars and what have you. Mm-hmm. So how can an equivalent program be developed in the UK or in Scotland, which channels the necessary resources in to address that diffuse pollution? Because there's that challenge of identifying the source, but our rivers are impacted largely by diffuse agricultural pollution, for example, and also from forestry. But
no, that's a really great point. I think that's an area where we could probably pull a lot of additional information from. That would probably be very helpful. So, okay. Noted. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else have any? Okay. So I'll just dive in the last kind of 10 minutes. I'll just kind of walk you through really quickly an assessment approach that I've been quite involved in the States for the last, let's see, doing my math, 11 or 12 years or so. So essentially, as I mentioned, credits are tied to ecosystem function. Back in 2012, EPA funded the development of this conceptual and communication framework that's called the Stream Functions Pyramid. And essentially, the primary thought process behind the pyramid is that if you want to achieve a certain level of functional capacity, you need to know what supporting functions you need, right? So the idea that, if you want a functioning biological community, you have to have the water quality elements, the physical habitat elements, the hydraulics and the hydrology all kind of working together to kind of support the life histories of your native communities. So essentially, this is an organizational framework broken up into these 5 functional categories. And then each functional category has function-based parameters, which describe or support the functional statement. Each parameter is then broken out into 1 or more metrics that then would serve as an indicator to quantify that parameter. And then each metric is informed by reference curves. And so the approach that we have been developing in some of the states is what's called the stream quantification tool. And this is a spreadsheet calculator that essentially integrates commonly applied assessment approaches and commonly applied metrics or measurement methods to do a few things. So one is to look at numerical differences between an existing and a proposed stream condition. So looking at pre and post activity. It can also link activities to changes in stream condition. It can link restoration goals to restoration potential, incentivize high quality stream restoration, assist with site selection, and assist with kind of restoration approach. And essentially in here, scoring for each metric is based on regional reference expectations. The tool architecture is designed to be kind of flexible and scalable. It's intended to be applied at a project or reach scale, and it's really intended to include metrics that are responsive to change, so it can characterize lift and loss. And so it's a tool that we have, sorry, I'll just show you here. So really kind of the tool itself is not like an ambient assessment approach, right? It's not going to say this is a high quality water. It's really intended to look at that delta or that change associated with project activities. So really trying to quantify the lift and the loss that's associated with a project. So here, you know, it's set up to evaluate your existing pre-project condition and evaluate your post-project condition, have that monitored over time, and all of these different condition events are then kind of related back and tied back to what the reference expectation or the reference condition would be for that site. And so this is just to show you kind of the geographic spread of stream quantification tools. So these are all places where we've or someone has regionalized or developed stream quantifications for use primarily in the regulatory program. So the regionalization process to move it kind of from one state to another involves a steering committee approach where we bring in local and regional resource agency expertise to identify, you know, regional priorities, priority functions, any unique resources that we need to think about in how the tool is applied, you know, what the established methods and metrics are that they're using to quantify streams and to assess streams in those areas, and then, you know, what are the available data sets that they have to develop regional reference expectations. So we've seen these developed, you know, for different states for use in kind of stream and wetland markets. And I'll just also point out that there are some people in the states who are adapting the stream quantification tools to be species specific. So we have folks in the southeastern US who have been looking at adapting the stream quantification tool for hellbenders in the southeastern United States. So we do see kind of the use of it in species specific contexts as well. But essentially just kind of as an overview of the scoring and how all the metrics or measurement methods sit together in the tool. Essentially, each indicator or metric has your measured field value, which is your data input, and then that's converted into an index value on a 0 to 1 scale based on reference expectations. So reference curves are developed for each metric using existing data sets, literature values. Where that's not available, expert opinion. And oftentimes these index values are stratified as needed to capture regional variation in the metric response. These metric scores are then rolled up into the parameter scores, category scores, and then an overall score. Because stream and wetland markets evaluate aquatic functions as a whole, the overall score is typically used for crediting and debiting. And so that overall score, in the case of the stream quantification tools and how they're currently applied, they're multiplied by the stream length of the project to help account for the scale of the project. And that gives this, you know, condition times length score, which we call a functional foot. And then that's really used as that base unit in developing credits and debits. So this is kind of what it looks like in some of the summary tables. So here you can see you have your 5 functional categories, you have your function-based parameters, and then you have the 0 to 1 index scoring rolled up for each of them. And then that kind of can roll up at that level as well. And so that kind of is how it's used. And I'm running out of time, so I won't, I think I'm probably gonna have to stop there. But yeah, there's a lot more to the tool if folks are interested in understanding kind of the specifics of it. You know, I can go through, there's the metrics for each level that are used and whatnot. So there's a wealth of information here as far as how it's been applied in different states. But that might be a conversation for another time.
Thank you so much, Julia. That's really fascinating. There's a lot in there I didn't know, and I'm sure there's a lot that can be fed into the Woodland Water Code development and CEPA's work as well. So yeah, and I'm sure there'll be further questions. You know, Julia is on Basecamp. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer any questions about this webinar. And yeah, we're at time. So yeah, I'll say thank you very much for joining. Please keep in touch. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.